Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear was never meant to reach you. Not now. Not ever. The file was buried so deep inside a defunct psychiatric archive that even the custodians swore it didn't exist. But it does. And tonight, you and I are stepping into it together. They called them the Nocturne Quadruplets, 4 identical girls born to Reinhardt Vale and Miriam Vale, a couple who appeared ordinary enough for a sleepy Midwestern town in 1930. But the moment their first cry bled through the thin hospital walls, something in the nurses' faces shifted. One described it later in a note she never intended anyone to see as the sound of 4 minds entering a world they were already too aware of. Understand this, the Vale family became a myth not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. A controlled experiment hiding behind the mask of a home. A father obsessed with purity, discipline, and the ancient doctrines whispered through his bloodline. A mother trained, yes, trained to obey the architecture of his ideology. And 4 daughters born into a house where affection was replaced with measurement, where playtime was replaced with observation, and where every cry, every gesture, every flicker of emotion was cataloged like data in a private laboratory. Officially, the Valles were a devout, quiet, hard-working American family. Unofficially, researchers would later call their home the earliest known domestic prototype of psychological compartmentalization in the United States. But that was long after the damage was done. The neighbors saw nothing. That's how all great manipulations begin. Not with violence, but with silence. A trimmed lawn, polished porch, a father who nodded stiffly at the mailman, a mother who smiled just enough to avoid questions. The facade was flawless, but inside was the real America, the hidden one, the one that crafts obedient citizens by breaking the curiosity out of children before they ever learn to name it. Reinhardt Vale didn't raise daughters. He engineered them. From birth, he subjected them to routines that resembled spiritual rituals, scientific trials, and military drills woven into a single ideology, one he claimed descended from older kingdoms, from men who believed the mind could be shaped like metal if heated with enough fear. By age 3, the Nocturne Quadruplets didn't laugh. They didn't play. They synchronized. And that unnatural synchronicity is what drew the government's eyes to their doorstep. This is where the story truly begins. Before anyone outside the Vale household even knew the Nocturne Quadruplets existed, Reinhardt had already constructed the first layer of their prison not from wood or brick, but from belief. His own, Miriam's, and eventually the girls'. You see, men like Reinhardt never begin with chains. Chains are crude, visible, weak. No true control begins with stories. The ones whispered in the dark. The ones repeated until they become law. Reinhardt's law began with a myth he inherited from his own mother, a fractured legend about the 4 mirrors, an ancient doctrine claiming that 4 identical souls could serve as a single vessel for higher order consciousness. According to him, the Valles weren't just a family. They were chosen, a bloodline destined to shepherd a new psychological era, one where emotion was eliminated and unity was absolute. Miriam listened to these beliefs the way a drowning woman listens to the man who promises land. She had entered marriage like a refugee seeking safety, and Reinhardt offered structure, certainty, a world where every decision had purpose. She didn't understand the cost until it was already too late. The routines began early. At sunrise, synchronized feeding. The girls sat in a row, high chairs bolted to the floor, Miriam spooning food from left to right, while Reinhardt timed each swallow with a pocket watch. Mid-morning, observation hour. The girls were placed in separate corners of the living room, given identical toys, and watched silently as Reinhardt recorded their behaviors on yellowed note cards. Not how they played, but how quickly they stopped playing. Afternoon, alignment sessions. The quadruplets were positioned shoulder to shoulder on the hardwood floor, instructed through gestures to mimic one another's posture, breath rate, and gaze direction. If one broke formation, the session began again. Evenings were the worst. That's when Reinhardt performed what he called purification readings, passages written in a journal he refused to let Miriam touch. His voice droned like a ritualistic chant, telling the girls that individual thought was weakness, that unity was strength, and that the outside world existed only to corrupt them. By age 5, the girls no longer responded to their names. He had replaced them with symbols, 4 geometric marks he burned into small wooden tiles. Each daughter knew her tile. Each tile had rules. The neighbors saw nothing. The church noticed nothing. No one asked why the veiled children never spoke. But the state did. And their interest wasn't driven by concern. It was driven by opportunity. The first time the state took notice, it wasn't because someone reported abuse. No, that would require a community willing to see what stood in front of them. Instead, it began with a school census worker who knocked on the veiled door in late autumn of 1936, asking why the quadruplets hadn't been enrolled. Reinhardt answered with a smile. A rare one. The kind that stretches the mouth but never touches the eyes. Private instruction, he said. He lied. But the lie was crafted with precision, the type of lie institutions don't question, because it aligns with their unspoken interests. The census worker filed her report. A supervisor flagged it, not because of concern for the children, but because 4 genetically identical girls raised in isolation represented something valuable, something researchable. Within months, the Vallas received their first visitor, Dr. Halden Marsh, a government-affiliated psychiatrist whose public work focused on developmental anomalies. Privately, his interests were far darker. He believed that children like the Nocturne Quadruplets, children shaped under abnormal psychological conditions, might reveal the architecture of obedience itself. Marsh didn't challenge Reinhardt. He admired him. When he entered the Vale home, he found the girls sitting in perfect formation on the floor, legs folded identically, heads tilted at the same angle as though synchronized by some unseen conductor. They didn't blink at the same time, but close enough that Marsh felt the hairs rise on his neck. He took notes rapidly, not out of fear, out of hunger. He asked the girls simple questions. They didn't speak. He asked them to stand. They rose in unison. He asked them to look at him. For pairs of identical eyes locked on him with unnerving calm, the kind you expect from soldiers or monks, not children. Marsh left the house with a revelation. The Vallas had accidentally or intentionally created a living experiment in conformity. He wrote in his private journal, "If replicated, the psychological methods in this household could yield a population incapable of dissent." That single sentence sealed the quadruplets' fate. Because once the government identified potential, they did what institutions always do. They positioned themselves not as protectors but as harvesters. Within weeks, the Vallas became part of an unofficial program, one without paperwork, oversight, or ethical boundaries. Marsh visited frequently. He observed the girls, interviewed Reinhardt, and quietly deepened the father's obsessions by validating them as scientifically promising. Miriam watched this new alliance form with dread. She didn't understand the full scope, but she sensed the truth. Her daughters weren't being studied. They were being claimed. And no one, not even she, could stop what was coming next. The moment Dr. Marsh secured his unofficial access, the Vale household shifted from a private experiment to something far more calculated, a joint venture between a fanatical patriarch and an institution hungry for data no legitimate laboratory could ethically collect. What emerged was a system designed not merely to observe the Nocturne Quadruplets, but to shape them. Marsh began by reinforcing Reinhardt's authority. He told him his methods were groundbreaking, that ancient cultures had practiced similar rituals to build unwavering loyalty among warrior castes and priestly orders. Reinhardt absorbed every word. Validation is the purest narcotic to a man ruled by obsession. And Marsh didn't stop there. He brought tools. Not instruments of torture, those leave marks. No, he brought instruments of suggestion. Flashcards printed with symbols. Metronomes with adjustable tempos. A set of tuning forks calibrated to specific frequencies. Even a reel-to-reel recorder used to play long, droning tones the girls were instructed to breathe in rhythm with. Reinhardt implemented each new device with zealous enthusiasm. Miriam watched, powerless, as their home transformed into a hybrid of a monastery, a laboratory, and a cultic shrine. Marsh insisted on maintaining a calm, orderly environment, not for the girls' well-being, but to eliminate variables that could contaminate the results. The results he wanted were obedience, predictability, unity. The girls, now 6, responded exactly as Marsh hoped. Their synchronization shifted from eerie coincidence to something more engineered. When one lifted her hand to scratch her cheek, the others mirrored the movement within seconds. When one turned her head toward a sound, 3 identical gazes followed immediately, like extensions of a single nervous system. Marsh recorded everything. But the most disturbing sessions occurred in the basement, a place Reinhardt had rarely used before Marsh's arrival. Under the psychiatrist's direction, the space was cleared, scrubbed, and outfitted with a single hanging bulb and chalk markings on the concrete floor. Circles, lines, directional arrows. This was where he conducted what he called differentiation trials. The goal: identify whether any of the girls retained even a shred of individuality. He separated one child from the others, leaving her alone under the harsh light. The remaining 3 sat at the top of the stairs, instructed not to move or speak. Marsh would question the isolated girl in a soft, deliberate voice, watching for hesitation, for distress, for anything suggesting independent emotional experience. He found none. Each girl sat silently, breathing steadily, eyes distant but focused, as though listening to something deeper than Marsh's voice, something internal, communal. When the sessions ended, the quadruplets reunited without embracing, without relief, but with an uncanny ease, like 4 parts of a machine sliding back into alignment. That was the moment Marsh realized the truth. They weren't losing their individuality. It had been dismantled piece by piece long before he arrived. By the time the girls reached 7, the Vale home had become a fortress of secrecy. Curtains always drawn, doors locked from both sides. Neighbors heard whispers, rhythmic tapping, the low hum of machines at odd hours, but no one confronted Reinhardt. Men like him thrive because the world prefers discomfort over conflict. Silence became his shield. But something else was beginning to form in that house. Tension, a fracture, a quiet rebellion, not from the girls, but from Miriam. She had always been obedient, molded by fear and exhaustion into the perfect accomplice. But the presence of Dr. Marsh, with his smirking politeness and predatory curiosity, awakened something in her that Reinhardt had never accounted for: guilt. It started with small acts: pausing before waking the girls, delaying a routine, whispering their birth names when Reinhardt was out of earshot, as if trying to call back souls that had been methodically erased. One night, she attempted something far bolder. She tried to ask the girls a forbidden question. "Do you know your sisters?" She expected confusion, maybe silence, but what she saw instead froze her from the inside out. The 4 girls turned toward her in perfect synchrony, eyelids opening at the same moment, heads tilting in mirrored angles. And then, impossibly, they smiled. Not warmly, not childishly, but with a calm, chilling coherence that did not belong to children. It was the first time Miriam understood. Her daughters didn't merely obey. They shared something, something cultivated, something designed. And Marsh had been waiting for this moment. The next week, he introduced a new procedure, one he disguised as an environmental stress test. But his journal entries, uncovered decades later, revealed the truth. This was an initiation ritual, a threshold, a test to see whether the girls could maintain unity under duress. He played discordant sounds through the reel-to-reel recorder, shrill frequencies layered over low, vibrating drones that made the basement walls tremble. The girls sat in the chalk circle, hands on their knees, breathing as one. First, nothing happened. Then something did. They didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't retreat inward. Instead, their breathing matched the rhythm of the noise, adapting, absorbing, transforming it into a new pattern Miriam couldn't comprehend. It was Marsh who whispered the description that would haunt her forever. They're synchronizing with chaos. That night, Miriam made a decision. Not to escape, she knew Reinhardt would hunt her down. Not to fight, she knew she would lose. No. She decided to do the one thing neither man anticipated. She began documenting everything. Because she understood something both men had overlooked. You cannot control a story once it's written down. Miriam's secret journal began as a whisper in the dark, thin, fragile pages hidden behind loose floorboards beneath the girl's room. But within weeks, it grew into something else entirely. A counterspell against the house's madness. She recorded dates, routines, symbols, even the subtle shifts in the girl's behavior that neither Reinhardt nor Marsh noticed. And with each entry, she felt a dangerous truth rising inside her. If the girls were becoming a single mind, then her notes were the only proof they had ever been individuals at all. Meanwhile, Marsh intensified his visits. He arrived with folders stamped with government seals, carrying new methodologies borrowed from wartime behavioral studies and secret institutional pilots. Reinhardt accepted every recommendation with fanatic devotion, but Marsh was no longer feeding the father's ego, he was studying it, testing it, seeing how far a man with absolute domestic power would go if given scientific justification. The girls became subjects of increasingly disorienting trials. Light deprivation, rotating sound frequencies, forced mirror-gazing exercises, even controlled isolation in separate, darkened rooms where they were instructed to hum a single note for hours. The note E minor became the pulse of the house. A dull, vibrating thread Miriam could hear through the walls at night, even after the girls were asleep. One afternoon, Marsh brought a black case Miriam had never seen before. When he opened it, she saw 4 identical porcelain masks inside blank faces with hollow eyes and thin, expressionless lips. Reinhardt looked reverent, like he was seeing relics instead of props. Marsh explained the concept. The removal of facial identity will accelerate unity. When they cannot express, they cannot divide. Reinhardt placed the masks on each girl with trembling hands. What happened next was subtle, but Miriam saw it. A tremor in one girl's fingers, a stuttered inhale from another, a microfracture in their perfect symmetry. Fear. Not for themselves but for what they were becoming. That night, Miriam wrote a line that would later be circled in red by investigators. They aren't 4 children anymore. They're one system. But the most disturbing shift came not from the girls but from Reinhardt. He began speaking in plural. We are progressing. We are aligned. We are approaching purpose. Miriam realized with cold certainty that the transformation was no longer isolated to the daughters. Reinhardt was merging with the experiment. And Marsh, he was watching it unfold with the fascination of a man witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, a psychological construct that could reshape not just a household, but an entire society if replicated. This was no longer a study. It was evolution engineered by obsession. And it was about to turn catastrophic. Catastrophe never announces itself. Creeps. It builds. It waits for the exact moment when everyone involved believes they're finally in control. And in the Vale household, that moment came in the winter of 1938 when the girls were 8 years old, and the experiment had become so successful that both Reinhardt and Marsh believed they stood on the edge of a psychological breakthrough. They were right, but not in the way either man expected. It began with what Marsh labeled Cohesion Phase 2, a new trial, a new violation. The girls were instructed to sit in a tight circle, knees touching, palms joined, their porcelain masks reflecting the dim glow of a single lantern. Reinhardt walked around them slowly, reciting passages from his ancient doctrine, the one he claimed traced back to warrior orders that predated written history. Miriam stood at the doorway, numb. She wasn't allowed inside the circle anymore. Marsh had said her emotional interference compromised the data. But from the threshold, she saw something neither man noticed. The girls' breathing didn't just synchronize, it deepened, darkened, as though they were pulling air from a place beyond lungs, place beneath reason. Then it happened. One girl, the one Miriam privately called Leora, tilted her head. The others followed instantly. But this time, they didn't stop. Their heads kept tilting, slowly, steadily, until the angle looked unnatural, unstable.
Impossible.
Miriam gasped. Reinhardt barked at her to stay silent. Marsh furiously scribbled notes. Then the lantern flickered, and all 4 girls turned toward it with mechanical precision, as though responding to a single internal command. Their bodies remained still, but the air around them shifted, a vibration, a pressure, something Miriam would later describe as the sensation that the room itself was inhaling. Reinhardt stepped closer. "They're transcending," he whispered. But he was wrong. They weren't transcending. They were breaking. A thin, discordant hum rose from the circle, the same note they had been forced to practice in isolation, but now amplified, layered, multiplied. The lantern rattled. A crack spidered across one porcelain mask. Marsh stumbled backward, suddenly pale. For the first time, the girls moved without instruction. They turned toward Reinhardt with perfect unity but no longer in obedience. In recognition, as if finally understanding the architect of their suffering, and deciding what he now meant to the system they had become. This was the moment Miriam realized the experiment had inverted. The girls were no longer the subjects. They were the center. And everything else, Reinhardt, Marsh, the house, the doctrine, was orbiting something it could no longer control. Before we go on, if you're still watching, comment for mirrors, 4 mouths, twice. Once for who you were. Once for who you're becoming. Because the next step down this rabbit hole changes you irreversibly. The storm that had swallowed the Brackenridge estate spun itself into a whisper by dawn, as though exhausted by what it had witnessed. The trees around the manor stopped thrashing and stood eerily still, like penitents waiting for judgment. And yet, in that calm, in that sudden quiet, something felt wrong, horrifically wrong. Almost as if the night had removed more than it returned. Inside the house, the twins of light and shadow, what remained of them, sat in rigid silence. Nola clutching the broken silver amulet, Maeve staring at the space on the floor where their sisters had vanished. They didn't cry. They didn't speak. It was as though their grief had retreated into a deeper, colder place. A place that no human voice could ever reach again. Father Brackenridge rose stiffly from the chair where he had collapsed. His face gray from the strain of holding back forces he barely understood. He looked like a man who had tried to reason with a tidal wave. In the corner, Mother Elisand's hands trembled with the remnants of invocation, her breath shallow, her eyes unfocused. She whispered the same phrase over and over again. "They weren't supposed to answer. I never meant for them to answer." But Nola and Maeve knew better. The night had answered because the debt existed. Because the family had carried a secret that demanded its toll. Because the darkness was patient, and patience always collects. A low groan echoed through the house, a structural settling, or perhaps something else, something breathing. The walls, once covered in old genealogies, now bore faint scorch marks, as though fingers made of smoke had dragged themselves upward toward the ceiling. The floorboards where the summoning circle once glowed were now blistered into spirals, the kind that seemed to pulse if stared at too long. The 4 chairs of the quadruplets still remained. Only 2 were empty now, and yet not entirely. Nola reached out, hand trembling, and touched the seat of Lyra's chair. It was cold, but not cold like wood left in an unheated room. Cold like the absence of something that once lived. Cold like a memory exhaled through frost. Maeve spoke first. Her voice was raw, scraped thin, almost unrecognizable. "They're not gone," she whispered. "They're waiting." Father Brackenridge stiffened. Waiting for what? The twins turned to him in unison, their expressions eerily identical, their pupils slightly too wide. "For us," Nola said. "For the rest of the story," Maeve finished. And somewhere far beneath the floor, or far beyond the veil, 2 voices answered. Soft, echoing, hungry. "Only a few will see the truth." Comment for mirrors. For mouths twice to join those who have descended fully into forbidden knowledge. Dare to face the story the world tried to hide. Subscribe to witness more dark histories and hidden experiments that could change the way you see control, power, and the human mind.